The horizon belonged to them. Thousands of hooves hammered the earth into a singular, rhythmic roar that preceded the arrow storm. They moved like a flood, a fluid entity that ignored borders and dismantled armies before the enemy could form a battle line. The Mongol Golden Horde did not just win. They rewrote the geography of the world. From the edge of the east to the gates of the west, they carved the largest contiguous empire in human history. Their mastery was built on a simple, brutal efficiency, unmatched speed, lethal archery, and an ability to strike from distances that defied conventional warfare. Commanders watched their lines shatter, unable to find a target as the horsemen circled and struck, retreated and returned, until nothing remained but the dust of a broken kingdom. They were the masters of the steppe, a force that had turned the vast plains into a highway for conquest. No wall could hold them, no legion could outpace them. For decades, the name itself was a signal for surrender. History bent to their path, and for a time, it seemed as though nothing, not even the limits of the earth itself, could halt their advance. The rhythm of the conquest hit a wall. In 1346, the vast, rolling plains of the steppe gave way to the jagged stone of Kaffa. Jani Beg, the Mongol Khan, halted his advance at the edge of the Crimean coast. He looked up at the high, fortified walls of the Genoese trading port. This was not a theater for cavalry. It was a cage. He ordered the camp to be set. Thousands of men dismounted, their horses tethered in long, static lines. The fluidity of the steppe was replaced by the rigid, suffocating geometry of a siege. Engineers hauled heavy timber to construct trebuchets, while soldiers dug trenches to cut off the city from the sea. Jani Beg expected the stone to crumble under the pressure of starvation. He waited. The port was trapped, its supply lines severed, its gates bolted shut. The Mongols moved with the practiced ease of a machine that had done this 100 times before. They settled in, confident that the city would surrender without a fight. The surrounding landscape was soon carved into a grid of tents and supply depots. Everything was ordered. Everything was prepared for a slow, inevitable victory. The siege had begun. The routine of the siege was absolute. Every day, the sun rose over the stone battlements of Kaffa, and every day the Mongol lines held firm. But then, the nature of the war shifted.
It did not happen with a trumpet blast or a cavalry charge. It arrived in silence.
Within the sprawling tent city, men began to falter. A soldier would stumble while sharpening his blade, another would collapse while hauling timber. At first, it was dismissed as fatigue or the lingering heat of the Crimean summer.
Then, the pattern turned erratic. A healthy man would wake with a tremor,
unable to grip his bow, his strength draining into the earth. No blade could cut this enemy. No horseman could outrun it. Jani Beg observed the reports coming from the perimeter. More men were missing from their posts each morning.
The camp, once a humming engine of conquest,
grew quiet. The air itself seemed heavy, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the city walls.
They had come to starve out a port, but they were being consumed by something they could not see.
Touch, or command. The siege had ceased to be a hunt. It had become an altar. The order of the camp dissolved into a mire. Waste piled high in the narrow gaps between tents, ignored by men too weak to haul it away. Water supplies, drawn from stagnant runoff, turned foul. In the heat of the summer, the smell became a physical presence, heavy and thick.
Beneath the floorboards of the grain stores, the rats arrived. They thrived in the discarded scraps and overflowing refuse,
scurrying through the supply lines with impunity. Tiny,
dark shapes clung to their fur. These fleas, desperate for a new host, migrated from the rats to the soldiers huddled in their sleep.
The infection moved with every twitch of a restless sleeper. A man would brush a flea from his skin, unaware that he was inviting the end.
The camp was no longer a military formation. It was a petri dish of rot. Every movement of the grain, Every shift of the sleeping mats stirred the hidden dust of a coming catastrophe. The soldiers were literally sleeping on their own graves, unaware that the true enemy was not behind the stone walls of Kaffa, but beneath their own boots, multiplying in the dark, damp earth of the siege lines. The first sign was a sudden, sharp heat in the armpits and groin. Within hours, the skin tightened over hard, walnut-sized swellings. These buboes turned black, weeping dark fluid, and pulsed with a relentless, throbbing agony. A soldier would reach down to touch the pain, only to find the flesh already turning necrotic. The camp became a chorus of groans and dry, rattling breaths. Men who had once ridden across continents at full gallop now struggled to lift their heads from the dirt. The irony was absolute. The Mongol military doctrine demanded fluid maneuver and rapid strikes, yet they were now chained to the earth, unable to retreat or advance. Their horses stood idle, picking at withered grass, while their masters rotted in the shadow of the city they had failed to conquer. Every attempt to stand ended in a collapse. They were no longer warriors. They were prisoners of their own dying bodies. The vast, sweeping plains that had been their empire now felt 1,000 miles away. They were shackled to this static, mud-soaked graveyard, waiting for a finality that defied every blade and bow they possessed. Jani Beg walked the perimeter, but there was no one left to salute. The siege lines were a silent expanse of abandoned tents and discarded armor. Officers who had once commanded thousands lay in the mud, their voices reduced to wet, labored wheezes. The chain of command had evaporated,
replaced by the primitive demand for water and the crushing heat of the sun. A supply caravan arrived at the camp's edge, expecting to find a conquering force. Instead, the drivers pulled their horses to a halt, staring at the motionless rows of men. No arrows flew. No drums beat. The silence was absolute. Jani Beg looked toward the stone walls of Kaffa, then back at his own dying ranks. The empire that had conquered the world was being dismantled by an unseen force that ignored rank, skill, and history. He reached for his sword, but the weight felt useless against an enemy that could not be engaged on an open field. The realization settled into the air like a suffocating shroud. There would be no charge. There would be no victory. The siege had become a slow, agonizing execution. He turned away from the city, his gaze fixed on the heavy trebuchets sitting idle, their wooden frames groaning under the weight of the coming decision. Jani Beg signaled his remaining men. They did not move with the speed of warriors, but with the hollow, mechanical persistence of the doomed. He pointed toward the piles of the recently deceased, his order sharp and absolute. They were to drag the bloated, blackened bodies from the mud.
The men hesitated, then obeyed, gripping limbs that were slick with decay.
They hauled the corpses across the camp, the skin tearing under the strain of the rough ropes. One by one, the bodies were hoisted into the cradles of the massive trebuchets. The wood groaned in protest as the levers were cranked back, tension coiling tight in the thick hempen ropes. Jani Beg watched the process, his eyes fixed on the stone walls of Kaffa. He did not look at the faces of the fallen. He saw only projectiles. He saw a way to break the city that had defied his steel. The machines were primed, the counterweights secured, and the lethal cargo balanced in the sling.
The air in the camp grew heavy with the stench of the dead, now serving as the final
desperate ammunition of a dying empire. With a sharp nod, Jani Beg gave the signal to release the catch. The release pin snapped back with a violent crack. The trebuchet arm swung upward, a blurred arc of timber against the gray sky. The cargo lifted, spinning through the air, trailing bits of black, necrotic tissue. It was a grotesque, unnatural flight. Defenders on the ramparts of Kaffa looked up,
eyes widening as the first body cleared the stone parapet. It tumbled, striking the cobblestones with a wet,
heavy thud that echoed through the silent square.
Then another, and another. The air filled with the sickening sound of impact.
The bodies lay broken in the heart of the city, ruptured by the fall, releasing a foul,
Cloying stench that clung to the damp walls. The Genoese soldiers recoiled, scrambling backward, but the contact was already made. The fleas, disturbed by the sudden movement and the cooling of the corpses, leaped from the dead onto the living. Panic roared through the streets. Men screamed, pointing at the source of the rain, their shouts dissolving into frantic, incoherent prayers. The sanctuary of the walls was shattered.
The invisible killer had breached the gates, not by force of arms, but by the weight of the dead. Within minutes,
the first fevered shiver gripped the defenders, and the city began its slow, inevitable slide into the abyss. The terror was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, suffocating fog. By nightfall, the stench of decay had permeated the narrow alleys of Kaffa. It clung to the stone walls and the porous wooden shutters of every home. In the marketplace, merchants dropped their wares, clutching at their throats as the first swellings appeared under their arms.
The city's physician tried to close the gates, but the plague was already inside.
It moved from the barracks to the granaries, carried on the backs of rats and the frantic touch of the dying. Families barricaded themselves behind locked doors, hoping to outlast the sickness, but the silence inside was soon broken by the rattling breath of those succumbing to the fever. The Genoese soldiers, once the proud guardians of the port, now collapsed in the streets, their limbs blackened by necrosis.
There was no enemy to fight, no wall to defend. Every attempt to treat the sick only invited the fleas closer.
Order evaporated. The sound of prayer was drowned out by the screams of the desperate, echoing off the high stone towers. Kaffa was no longer a fortress. It was a sealed casket. The residents clawed at the heavy gates, begging for an escape that would never come. As the infection claimed one household after another, the walls offered no safety, only a perimeter for the grave. Merchants realized the truth as they watched their neighbors collapse in the shadow of the harbor gates. There was no cure, no respite,
and no future within these stone bounds. A collective, primal urge took hold: leave.
They abandoned their fortunes, their stockpiles, and their dignity, surging toward the docks in a chaotic, crushing tide. Every man fought for a space on the wooden planks of the galleys. Sailors shoved off in a frantic haste, desperate to clear the harbor before the infection could claim their own crews.
They hauled on the ropes, catching the wind as the city faded into a jagged silhouette behind them.
They believed they were escaping a localized war, leaving behind a failed siege. They did not know the truth. The dark weight of the plague was already settling into the dark crevices of their holds.
It clung to the damp wood, hidden in the fur of the rats that scurried through the grain stores.
As the ships carved lines into the black water of the sea, the merchants looked back at the dying port,
unaware they were not fleeing the apocalypse, but delivering it to the very heart of the world.
The horizon off Messina remained empty until the galleys appeared, drifting like aimless ghosts against the morning tide.
There were no shouts from the rigging, no rhythmic thud of oars hitting the water in unison.
The ships moved with a strange, lethargic hesitation, their sails tattered and sagging in the salt air.
When the first vessel bumped against the harbor pier, the harbor master stepped forward to demand payment, but the silence from the deck stopped him cold. He climbed the side, his boots thudding hollowly on the wood. He found the crew slumped over their posts. Some were motionless, their bodies stiffening in the heat. Others lay in the bilge, their skin mottled with dark, necrotic sores that wept foul fluid. They were dying at the oars, their hands still gripped to the handles as if death had caught them in mid-stroke. The harbor master recoiled, but it was too late. Rats, gaunt and frantic, scurried from the dark recesses of the hold, leaping onto the stone docks and vanishing into the bustling city streets. The cargo of death had been delivered. As the first bells of Messina began to toll,
the infection surged off the ships, moving silently through the port and into the arteries of the continent. The infection did not discriminate. It struck the pauper in the alley and the merchant in his counting house with equal, brutal efficiency. Within months, the vibrant hum of European life slowed to a jagged, irregular pulse. Villages that had stood for centuries fell into a sudden, unnatural quiet. Fields lay unplowed, the grain rotting in the soil as the hands that should have harvested it turned cold. Death became the only constant. Church bells rang incessantly until there were no hands left to pull the ropes. Families fractured, then vanished, leaving homes to stand as hollow monuments to the departed. The loss was staggering. As the years bled into one another, the toll climbed until more than half of the population had been erased. 60% of the continent simply ceased to exist. It was a total, absolute reset of the human landscape. The complex architecture of society, the trade networks, the legal systems, the feudal ties crumbled under the weight of the missing. What remained was a broken world, stripped of its people and forced to reckon with a reality that looked nothing like the past. The plague had not just killed, it had dismantled the very foundation of civilization. The siege of Kaffa stands as a grim intersection where legend collided with an invisible reality. We often look at history through the lens of emperors and armies, believing that the trajectory of humanity is guided by the hands of the powerful. Yet, the fall of the Golden Horde proves otherwise. They were the masters of the steppe, a force that had carved the largest contiguous empire in history, only to be dismantled by a microscopic organism that required no blade to conquer. This was not a defeat by a rival power, but a fundamental shift in the world order caused by a force no throne could command. It turned their own weapons of terror against them, transforming a military campaign into a global catastrophe. Ambition and conquest had opened a door that could never be closed again. The Black Death did not just kill. It erased the world that was and forced the survivors to build something entirely new upon the wreckage. It serves as a permanent reminder that the grandest designs of men are fragile. History is frequently shaped by factors far below the reach of human perception, moving in the shadows of our trade routes and across the battlefields of our greatest ambitions. The Mongol dream of total dominance ended not in glory, but in the silence of a continent redefined by tragedy. The organism had no goal, no crown, and no legacy. Yet it changed the course of human civilization more than any conqueror ever could. The world that emerged from the ashes was a different place, forever altered by the realization that we are not the sole architects of our own destiny.